We are wrapping up a long series of messages today called The Lazarus Life. It comes from the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11 and 12. Today is week 16 and our final chapter, our final segment here of the Lazarus story. So if you're unfamiliar with that story, Lazarus is a friend of Jesus who gets sick. He dies, and then Jesus shows up after Lazarus has been dead for 4 days and calls him back to life. So for the last 4 months, we have explored this story in depth, in detail, and talked about how it's really kind of a microcosm of the gospel. And Lazarus' story, in many ways, is our story. And it invites us to ask questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? And why doesn't Jesus act in the way I want him to and the timing that I want him to? What do I do when he shows up, but I think it's too late? How do I process my grief, my disappointment, my frustration to him and about the situation of my life? And in all of these questions and in so many more, Lazarus' story points our attention back towards Jesus, towards his presence, his plan, and his activity in every moment. And so today we're going to pick it up with a short little passage in John chapter 12 that is often not really mentioned much in the story of Lazarus. And we're going to talk about how the story of Lazarus is ultimately an invitation to run it back, to just tell this story over and over and over again. And even when God has showed up and he has done the miraculous and he has provided and he's brought resurrection and he's brought new life, there will be new obstacles. There will be new opportunities to trust him. And in those moments where we feel like we've come out the other side only now to face a new problem, we're just going to run it back and we're going to trust him again. So if you have a Bible, it'll be in John chapter 12, verse 9. If not, it'll be here on the screens for you. It says, "Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him." Lazarus' story at this point reminds us that the point of our life is to point to Jesus. All right, so kind of some context here. These events take place about a week before the events of Holy Week. All right, so this is right on the eve of Palm Sunday when Jesus rides into Jerusalem and he's welcomed as the king. It's a little more than a week before Good Friday when Jesus will be arrested and killed. It's a little more than a week before Easter Sunday when Jesus himself will be resurrected. And so on the verge of all of these things, Jesus has already received his death sentence from the religious leaders. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, that their response to the resurrection of Lazarus was, we have to kill Jesus before this gets out of hand anymore. And now they've decided, well, people aren't just coming to see Jesus, they're coming to see Lazarus as well. And when they see Lazarus, they see Jesus. And when they hear the Lazarus story, they hear the Jesus story. So we should go ahead and kill Lazarus too. Right? And so what they're reminding us of is Lazarus has reached this point where he's basically kind of a walking billboard for Jesus. Everywhere Lazarus goes, people point, right? And it's, hey, that's Lazarus. Did you hear the Lazarus story? He was dead. Right? And then Jesus called him out. And Lazarus' story always ends with Jesus. And because of Lazarus, I mean, can you imagine Lazarus just walking through the market in Bethany? How many people are going to stop him and ask him, what was it like? What did you experience? What happened? And every time Lazarus tells his story, he's telling the story of Jesus. Of, hey, I don't know what he said. I don't know what he talked about. I don't know if he wrote a book later of My 4 Days in Heaven, right? And became a first century bestseller. We don't know any of that. All we know is what John tells us. And what John tells us is because of Lazarus, people believed in Jesus. And because they believed in Jesus because of Lazarus, the religious leaders decided we need to kill Lazarus too. It's the point of the story that, like when you're a kid in Sunday school, the Lazarus story is just an awesome one. If you just finish with Lazarus walks out of the grave and goes back to Bethany, and then we're on to the rest of the stories in John's gospel. You don't really spend a lot of time with little kids being like, hey, so Lazarus was resurrected, and then everyone wanted to kill him. It's not really an encouraging finish, and yet it's the reality of it. But the thing that's interesting for us to consider this morning is that Lazarus, it doesn't seem like he minded that. Doesn't seem like he tried to avoid that. He just went about living his life, and he was perfectly happy to be a sign, a symbol, a reminder of the resurrection power of Jesus to everyone, everywhere. And what that invites us to consider this morning is this idea that our lives are supposed to function in the same way. Now, you may not have been physically resurrected from the dead, but the miracle that God has done in your life of forgiving your sins, restoring your soul, reconciling you to himself and to others is no less miraculous than what he did for Lazarus. And when we begin to live that out, when we begin to make our faith public in the same way that everywhere Lazarus went, people walked and said, hey, there's Lazarus. Have you heard what happened to him? So with you and I, there should be such a discernible difference in our life before and after Jesus that others look and say, hey, there Chris goes. Hey, there Michael goes. Hey, there Courtney goes. Hey, there Lacey goes. And do you know what Jesus has done for them? Do you know how different they are? And in those spaces, it's then on us to give Jesus credit for everything. Right? When someone comes to you and they ask for advice, now I know there are a lot of impressive people in the room. And I say that with all sincerity. I know so many of you. I know the things you've accomplished. I know the doors that God has opened for you. I know the type of marriages you have. I know the type of families you have. I know some of the dark nights that you went through. I know some of the opportunities that God has given you. And I know there are a lot of people in this room that others come to for advice. I know that because I go to a lot of you for advice. Right? And all of you who've put kids through college, I think I've talked to almost all of you of, please tell me how that works. Right? Like I've got a 16-year-old and we're just like loaves and fishes at this point. We see that college savings plan. But again and again and again, I hear from many of you, the Lord provides. Trust him, do your best, be disciplined, the Lord provides. And I hear that, right? And others of you, we've come to for marriage advice. We've come to for parenting advice. We've come to for career advice. We've come to for home advice, for financial advice, all of these types of things. I know you're impressive people. I know people come to you. But here's the thing that we have to understand. When people come to us for advice, our first and best piece of advice is always Jesus. Right? When somebody comes and maybe they know you're in education, they say, hey, I need to make sure I get a scholarship. What can I do? Right? I really want to get into the school. What can I do? Before you go down that road, your first advice is surrender everything to the Lord. Your first advice, when somebody looks at you and they says, hey, I want to do what you've done, before you launch into, well, here's the path to take, and here's the connections to make, and here's the disciplines to develop, the first step is always Jesus. Right? We have to point to him first. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want to have a marriage like yours, before I'm going to talk to him about communication and conflict resolution, I'm going to tell him, you've got to follow Jesus. You've got to surrender Jesus. As a parent, if somebody comes and says, hey, I want my kids to turn out like yours, right? And then we're going to say, you've got to follow Jesus. If they come to you and say, I don't want my kids to turn out like yours, you're going to tell them, then you've got to follow Jesus, right? However they come, the first piece of advice is just follow Jesus. Before you give financial advice, before you give business advice, career advice, before any form of advice, the first step for every follower of Jesus is anything you see in me is a reflection of what God has done for me. So I'm going to credit him first, I'm going to credit him loudest, and I'm going to help you understand that what you might see something in my life, or I might see something in your life, and I think, I want that. But what they're really longing for is not our stuff or our relationships, it's the peace that our soul has found in Jesus Christ. So that's why we have to give Jesus credit for everything. Everything in your life. Right? There is nothing you have received. James tells us in James chapter 1 that every gift comes from the Father. There is nothing you have in your life that you have earned on your own, that you have created on your own. He's the one who led you into the relationship and then enabled you to develop it. He's the one who gave you that natural intellect that you have applied in all of these different areas. There's nothing I possess, there's nothing I have that I achieved on my own. It all is a gift from him. And if it's all a gift from him, then it means anytime any of that gets attention, it's to reflect back on him. Right? Lazarus, when people would have come to him and said, Lazarus, tell us your resurrection story, he wouldn't have been like, so I was a really holy person. And I faithfully offered my sacrifices. And when I died, I got to heaven and I told God, you owe me. Send me. He didn't do any of that, right? What was his story? I was sick, and then I was dead, and then next thing I know, Jesus is calling my name. And I'm walking out of a grave. Lazarus' story from beginning to end is a Jesus story. And it's not just that moment of resurrection that Lazarus would have told, but as people would have come to him and said, Lazarus, tell us a story, he would have backed up. Like he lives in an oral culture, right? Where stories are transmitted by one person to another. So he's not necessarily writing it down and passing out his pamphlets, But he's just telling the story. And any good storyteller knows you never start with the highlight. You always go back and do the full buildup. Right? This is why your grandpa can never tell you a quick story. Right? Everything is 15 minutes long. Right? Because why? Because he wants to build the suspense. He wants you to know everything about it. Right? And for Lazarus, what we're being reminded of is Jesus doesn't just use the resurrection part of our story, but he uses all of our story. So Lazarus, as he tells the story, he probably would have backed up and said, well, so it started when I first met Jesus. And he maybe would have told some of the stories of his first interactions with Jesus. And then maybe he would have told the story of how he got sick. And maybe he would have told the story of, and I just kept getting worse and worse. But I thought if Jesus would just come, I would be fine. Maybe he tells the story of, and I remember when Mary and Martha sent off for him. Right? And then Lazarus tells the story, but he never came. And the next thing I know, I hear him calling my name, and maybe he goes and he backfills some of the story of, and this is what Mary and Martha said happened during the 4 days that I was dead. Maybe he tells the disciples' story of, so we sent the messenger, and Jesus told the disciples I was only asleep, and they didn't need to worry about it, and they thought that's what he actually meant. And as he builds this whole story, every element along the way, the sickness, the doubts, the questions, the confusion, Jesus not acting in the way or the timing that they wanted him to, the misunderstanding of the disciples, the grief of his sisters, every moment along the way is a Jesus story. And every moment along the way points to the resurrection of Jesus. And then maybe Lazarus tells him, then he called me out. And I was in the dark, and I kind of bumbled, and I stumbled, and I rolled off, and I shuffled out to the exit of my tomb. And the next thing I knew, he's commanding people to get the grave clothes off of me, and it was stinking, it was smelling, it was uncomfortable, and it was vulnerable. And then we walked back to Bethany. And then maybe he tells the story of, and then we had him back a week later. And we threw this dinner for him, and I watched my sister pour her most valuable possession of perfume onto his feet in an act of gratitude and worship. And in all of these moments along the way, Lazarus is pointing to the power, the presence, and the worth of Jesus. The same thing happens with you and I. You see, when we say the point of life is to point to Jesus, it's not just in your most successful moments. In fact, oftentimes when people come to you to say, hey, tell me the difference in your life, it's not because you're tremendously successful. It's because you're navigating a dark and hard season of life with a peace and a joy that they don't understand. And they come and they say, how can you smile in the midst of that? How can you keep moving forward as you go through that? How can you have hope in such a miserable circumstance? And so Jesus is going to use all of our story, the highs and the lows. There's no part of your past, there's no part of your present, there's no part of your future that is unredeemable or unusable. Jesus can use every single moment. And it's often those darkest and hardest ones that he speaks through the loudest and the clearest to you and to those around you. Right? Why? I mean, we've talked about this several times over the past couple of years, that this idea that others, they admire our strengths, but they identify with us in our weakness. And as we're willing to tell the story of our weakness, as we're willing to tell the story of Jesus being with us, that's the space that gives hope. That's the space that causes others to turn. And what John tells us in John chapter 12 is there are people who are coming to Jesus because of Lazarus. And can you think, for all of the things that we strive for and long for all of the things that we want to be known for in life, is there a greater thing to be known for than I'm a person who helped someone else find Jesus? Is there a greater legacy to leave behind? Is there a greater story to tell? Right? Lazarus' greatest moment was not his moment of resurrection. It was a moment that all of these others began to put their faith in Jesus because of what Jesus had done for Lazarus. And God will allow us that same privilege. If we'll tell our story, if we'll give Jesus credit for everything, if we learn I'm not here to build my kingdom, I'm not here to try to get famous, I'm just here to tell the story of Jesus in me and through every circumstance, then what others will do is they'll look, they'll see, they'll ask questions, and many will place their faith in Jesus and find the same new life that we've experienced. Many, but not all. See, there's still always that, in this case, religious majority. I don't know what it might be in yours. It might be friends, it might be family, it might be people at work, it might be people at school, but there is always a group, because Jesus shows up and he creates a choice. You're with me or against me. Right? You're either for me or you're not. You don't get to remain neutral. And so when our lives testify to the glory and the power of Jesus, they also testify to the choice that every individual has to make. And while many will place their faith in Jesus, others will look at us and respond like the religious leaders did of, we just got to get you back in that grave. Right? We can't have this. We can't listen to it. I mean, listen to the way that John phrases it. In verse 10, so the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. Now, we hit on this in depth 2 weeks ago when we talked about, when Jesus shows up, some celebrate and others hate. Not everyone is happy when he comes, and the religious leaders especially, they hated Jesus because he was an interruption and he was a threat. He was disrupting their normal order of life, and he was a threat to their power, their wealth, and their prestige, and so they decided we're going to kill him. So when Lazarus shows up, and because of Lazarus, even more people are placing their faith in Jesus, they decide they're going to hit Lazarus with the same big stick they plan on hitting Jesus with. Capital punishment. Well, we'll just kill him. And now again, they're about a week and a half out from learning that their death sentences mean absolutely nothing. Right? They're going to kill Jesus, and then Jesus is going to be resurrected. And then everything they feared of the world going over to him and them losing it all, it's all going to happen because he can't be defeated. Right? And so you're in this space, and just put yourself in the position of Lazarus this morning. You've been resurrected. You've welcomed Jesus back into your home. You've resumed your career. Everywhere you go, people want to know what happened, and you're telling them the story of Jesus. And it's just like you're just riding this continual high of the power, the glory, the might of God. And then shortly thereafter, somebody comes to you and they say, hey, Lazarus, they want to kill you too. Now, I wish John told us Lazarus' response. But he doesn't. And because he doesn't, I think it invites us to consider how we would respond in that situation. All right, some of us might be a little exasperated. Like, for real? Again? I just did this. How about Martha? She's always telling me what to do, kind of sick of her. Miss the food. But, there's just that. We don't know. We don't know if he just kind of laughed it off of like, yeah, good luck. We don't know if he ran and hid. We don't know exactly. We don't know if he rolled his eyes. We don't know if he broke out into tears. We have no idea. But I do think it's important to note that what John doesn't tell us is he doesn't say they wanted to kill Lazarus, so Lazarus ran away. They wanted to kill Lazarus, so Lazarus stopped talking about Jesus. He just says, hey, they wanted to kill Lazarus. And so I think what we can assume based off of Lazarus' experience is even if he felt fear, it was a much smaller fear than he felt the first time he died. Even if he was worried, he wasn't nearly as worried as he had been before. And because for Lazarus, he not only knew what was on the other side, but he knew who was on the other side. And so it's got to be that peaceful moment of like, they want to do that again? That's fine. We sing a song occasionally at Christian Chapel called In Christ Alone. And there's the middle part of that song that I think describes how I believe Lazarus would have felt when he gets this news. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I stand. See, Lazarus knew their death sentence was meaningless. Because when you not only know the resurrection and the life, but you know that the resurrection and the life knows you, and he knows you by name and he knows where you live, you don't really walk around with a lot of fear. When you've already experienced death and you've experienced the presence of God and you've been brought back into the presence of Jesus, there's not a lot of trepidation of what the future might hold. So you can almost sense Lazarus kind of laughing it off if they want to kill me. Do they know what Jesus does? Do they know who Jesus is? But it does invite us to consider this idea that sometimes our testimony creates a target. Now, we would love to live in the first part of Lazarus' story, where Jesus shows up and he works and he moves and he brings resurrection, and then we just get to walk around, and everywhere we go, we tell the story and people love it and they follow Jesus as well. But there's the other side of that, of when Jesus causes new life to come to you, you now become an interruption and a threat everywhere you go. And as people are forced to decide about Jesus because of what Jesus has done for you, many will accept, but some, and sometimes many, will reject. And their rejection of you will be personal. Their rejection of you, just for Lazarus, it's like they're not following the arc of the story, right? Like, he's been through the suffering. He's reached the height of the conflict. And then he has the resolution of resurrection, and that's where the story is supposed to end. He's not supposed to have to circle back to the beginning and do it all over again. Yet that's exactly what happens, and that's what happens for you and I a lot of times as well. We can carry this idea of Jesus has called my name. He's led me into new life, and now all my problems are behind me. And now all my troubles will never be seen again. But what do we experience? As we begin to live in the resurrection power, we find there is other power at work in our world that is opposed to that. Because it's opposed to it, it creates a target for me, it creates a target for you, on our front, on our back, on our relationships, on our business, on our kids, on our families. And that target is the enemy coming to seek to kill and steal and destroy everything that God has done. Right? Because if he can't change our story, maybe he can at least divert us off the path. And so he's going to come for you. And the fact that there's a target on you doesn't mean Jesus has abandoned you. It doesn't mean Jesus has left you. It just means there's an enemy who sees the potential of your life to bring others to Christ. And so he's going to do anything he can to get you off that path. So when you find yourself in those moments, don't get discouraged. Don't give up. Don't feel like, oh, here we go again. I can't believe it. I hope Jesus can come. But when you're in that space, we're not told how Lazarus responds, but we got to believe he responds with peace. We got to believe he responds similar to the way Jesus responds when the religious leaders threaten to kill him and he says, hey, you don't have any power over me except what my Father has given you. Now, you're not really in charge. You're not really directing the affairs of my life. And as Jesus points our attention towards God's continual interaction in our lives, it reminds us that he's directing every single step. And so if you feel like I've went through the Lazarus story, I had the sickness, I had the grief, I had the loss, I had the pain, Jesus did show up, he called me by name, he led me into new life, it was wonderful, it was awesome, I was telling other people about him, and now it's hard again. When it gets difficult again, don't give up. Just have that decision of, okay, we're just going to run it back. And we're going to tell this story over again. When I was Angie and I, we grew up in Topeka, Kansas. And there was a kid that I went to church with and I also went to school with. And he and I, we were kind of friends, right? You know how that goes as teenagers. And not close friends, but we knew each other. We were in the same circles in a lot of places. And so basketball tryouts came our freshman year, and I made the team, and he didn't. And they came our sophomore year, and I made the team, and he didn't. And it really wasn't that I was particularly good. It's that he was particularly bad. And so junior year, same thing happens. I made the team, and he didn't. And then senior year, I made the team, and he didn't. So there's this long established pattern of I make the team, and you don't. Well, our senior year, he somehow decided that he was better at basketball than I was. Which that's fine, you know, he can have his opinion. We had 4 years of proof, and then he started to tell my other friends, well, you know, it's just political that Chris made it over me because my family, we didn't move here till 8th grade, and so that's why I didn't make it because the coaches don't know me like they know him, and you know, I wouldn't handle that well now, and I really didn't handle that well as an 18-year-old. So I made it my mission. Now, this is not a like, hey, the Spirit was at work in me. This was 100% like flesh and probably borderline sinful. But so my response is, kid and I, we had a weightlifting class. It was our PE class together. And at the end of every day, we'd have about 15 minutes of free time. So my friends started telling me, like, hey, he's telling everybody that he should have been on the team over you and that you're terrible and all this. Now, super passive-aggressive. I did not confront it in any way, but every day for an entire school year, I said, let's play one-on-one. You and me. Come on, let's go. So we would play for 15 minutes, and I whipped him day after day after day after day. And after a couple weeks, I would make him deals of like, okay, today I'm only going to play with my left hand. All right, I'll give you a chance. I'd make deals with him. I won't shoot in the lane. I'll only shoot 3-pointers. All kinds of things. And just whipped him day after day after day. And he got to the point of like, I don't want to play anymore. I'm like, I don't care. We're going to run it back. Let's go. Let's go, let's go. And we never had a conversation. Now, again, that is not it's probably shouldn't even be used as a sermon illustration because it was pride and it was anger and it was bitterness and it was all these sorts of things. But here's what I want you to know. Every day I told him, let's run it back, I had 100% confidence in the outcome. There was no way he was ever going to beat me. Right? I could go to Topeka right now and find him. We're friends on Facebook. I'll send him a message afterwards. Be like, I will meet you at any playground in Topeka, and I will whip you one more time, just so you know. Why? Now, what is that? It was just that confidence of I knew that outcome. And it didn't matter what the variables were. It didn't matter how I felt that day or how I ate that day. It was going to turn out the same way again and again and again and again. For some of you, you've had a similar experience with your kids. Right? Maybe you're playing video games or a board game or you're playing outside with them and there's a game that they're just never going to beat you at. But they want to keep running it back and their stamina is greater than their skill. So they're just going to keep coming again and again and again. But you're a good dad. You're a good mom who's teaching your kids. You got to earn things in life. So you're not going to let them fake win, right? They're going to earn it or they're going to learn to lose. Like those are the options, right? So you live with kind of that space. When they come for Lazarus and say, hey, they're going to kill you again, I got to think he has that little moment of like, well, just run it back. I know how this story ends. They might succeed. They might get me back in the grave, but they cannot keep me there. And Jesus is going to put this on display for them in about a week where they're going to say, hey, we're going to show you once and for all. And Jesus, they're going to kill him in a spectacular fashion. They are going to publicly beat him. They are going to humiliate him. They're going to crucify him. They're going to put him in the tomb. They're going to seal the tomb. They're going to guard it with soldiers. They're going to do everything they can to be certain. And Jesus' response is like, so you want to run it back? This is how it ends every single time. You can do whatever you want, but I am the resurrection and I am the life. And I'm always going to come out of that grave. That's the confidence Lazarus has. That's the confidence you and I have to have that every story is a resurrection story. And so if you're in a hard space this morning, my encouragement to you is to go home today, get your Bible, right? And maybe not even your iPad or your phone, but get out your physical Bible and turn to John chapter 11 and begin to reread that story of Lazarus. And as you reread that story of Lazarus, locate where you are in it today. Right? Because we're always somewhere in that story arc. And so you might feel like today you're at the very beginning of that story where it says, now a man named Lazarus from Bethany was sick. And you're in a space where bad things are happening and you're struggling to understand, why do bad things happen to good people? Why is the Lord allowing this to happen? And you're going to locate yourself right there. And you're going to say, God, this is where I am, and this is where I need you to speak. And you know what he's going to do? He's going to start to remind you, hey, we've been here before. And we're just running it back. We're just going to tell the same story in a new way. We're just going to have the same outcome, but we're going to take a different path to get there. Maybe you keep reading through Lazarus' story and you see when the messenger comes to Jesus and they say, Lord, the one you love is sick. And Jesus says, this sickness will not end in death. And what you need to be reminded of this morning is your current situation is a stage for God's glory. That he is at work. He has a purpose and a plan. What you're going through has not caught him by surprise, has not caught him off guard, but he is working in it. Or maybe you're in a season of waiting and you think, I know that God sees me, I know he knows me, I know he has a plan for me, but my goodness, can he do it already? And you're going to read that portion that says Jesus promised his sickness would not end in death, and then he stayed where he was 2 more days. And you're going to have to be reminded that God's plans are God's plans, and that involves his timing. And he might not always do it in the way I want, he might not always do it when I want, but he always accomplishes his plans. And then maybe you keep reading and you see his interactions with the disciples, or 2 days later he tells them, all right, let's go back to Bethany. And they object of, Lord, they tried to kill us the last time we were there. He says, it's okay, Lazarus is sleeping, I need to go wake him up. They say, Lord, if he's asleep, he'll wake himself up. And Jesus finally tells them, look, he's dead. And I've got to go there to raise him. And maybe you're in a spot this morning as you read through the story of Lazarus, you feel like your problems are insurmountable. They're so big. That diagnosis is real and unchanging. That grief is heavy and unrelenting. That job loss is permanent and there's no prospects on the horizon. That child is gone and doesn't want anything to do with you. And as you read Jesus speaking to the disciples and telling them, look, death is like sleep. What that's supposed to do is you locate yourself in that part of the story. It's supposed to help you reframe your perspective on your problems. That if Jesus says death is sleep, then everything I'm dealing with is inconsequential to him this morning. He's not batting an eye. There's not a bead of sweat on his forehead. He can handle it perfectly and finally. Or maybe you continue to read that story and you see Jesus showing up at Bethany and Martha runs out of town to meet him. And she falls at his feet and she begins to express her grief and say, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And maybe that's where you are in the story this morning. You're at that point of frustration. You're at that point of aggravation. You're at that point of, Jesus, where were you? And if you just would have showed up, none of this would have happened. And in that space, Jesus is inviting you to pour out the grief. He's inviting you to pour out the frustration. Mary comes to him later and she echoes the exact same thought. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus does not reprimand Mary or Martha. But instead, he tells them, I'm the resurrection and the life. And in the moment of our grief, in the depths of our anger, God still, he welcomes us to vent, to lay it all out before him, and then he meets us with his truth of, even there, I'm the resurrection and the life. Or maybe you read Martha's response, and she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died, but even now, I believe God can give you whatever you ask. And you need to make that statement this morning. You're in some even now type moments of, I never wanted to be here. I don't know what God's plan is, but even now, even here, even if, even when, I'm going to trust him. I'm going to believe in him. I'm going to follow him. And as you locate yourself in that moment of the story, you begin to see Jesus is present and Jesus is active. Or maybe you need to locate yourself at the moment where Jesus has seen their tears and it says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he wept with them. And what you need to know this morning is God sees your pain. He sees your hurt. He sees the heartache. He sees the frustration. He knows the underlying causes, not just of your circumstances, but the sin that causes all death and destruction. And not only does he come and weep with you in your grief, but he is deeply moved in spirit and troubled to the point of action. Right? And if you remember, as we worked through that portion of the story, we talked about how Jesus doesn't just come with a Kleenex, but he comes with the cross. He comes to provide a perfect solution to everything that plagues us. And then Jesus turns to them and he says, now take me to the place where you've laid him. Right? And for some of us this morning, we've expressed our grief and we've told God about our frustration. But what we're being reminded of in the Lazarus story is Jesus doesn't just want to hear about it, he wants to see it. He wants you to take him to it. He wants you to point it out and name it. He wants you to say, this is the source of pain. This is the source of heartache. This is the person who hurt me. This is the dream that died. This is the thing that didn't go how I thought it would go. This is where I caused destruction. This is where I caused hurt. This is what I think is unredeemable. And Jesus doesn't want to just kind of do it from afar. He says, take me right up to it. And he wants to sit with you at that point of pain, and then he wants to take action. As you keep reading Lazarus' story, we see he's in the graveyard, and Jesus tells those who are with him, roll away the stone. He doesn't just want to see it, he wants to get in there, he wants to get involved. Right, and there's some spots in our lives that maybe we have walled off, and as you kind of circle back again, you feel like, man, all over again, I've got to live out this story. Maybe it's because you refuse to roll away the stone. So Jesus is just going to keep taking you back until you finally roll it away. And as you roll it away, his light floods our darkness, and that stench of death escapes, and it's real and it's powerful. But Jesus isn't intimidated, and Jesus doesn't care. He's there to bring life. And so there's just this constant invitation of where are you and where does it fit in Lazarus' story? And then there's that moment that we can all identify with where Jesus stands outside of the tomb and he prays this really simple prayer that basically says, Lord, I'm praying for their benefit, not mine, because I know you hear me. And then with one word, everything changes. And he calls him out and he says, Lazarus. And at the moment he speaks his name, life is restored while his circumstances remain the same. Before Lazarus walks out of the tomb, he's called to life and he's laying there as a dead man, wrapped in his burial clothes in the darkness. And you and I, sometimes we're going to locate ourselves in that spot of, man, I hear Jesus calling my name, but nothing around me is changing quite as quickly as I want it to. I hear him calling my name, but the pull of addiction is still strong. I hear him calling my name, but the relationships are still a disaster. I hear him calling my name, but the bank account is still empty. I hear him calling my name, but my health hasn't changed at all. But in that moment, what we're learning is our life does not depend on what's going on around us, but on the one who calls us. And then Jesus gives Lazarus those words, come out. And we're reminded when Jesus speaks life, he also speaks words of obedience. And so maybe where you're going to locate yourself this morning is you're in that spot where Jesus has called you by name, but now he's telling you to come out, and you've got to get out of where you are and into where he's calling you to be. Lazarus would have been wrapped head to toe. He would have been placed on a little shelf in the side of the cave. Nobody comes in the tomb for him. He has to roll himself off. He has to shuffle out to the exit. And when Jesus calls your name and tells you to come out of the old way of life you've been in, it's going to be awkward. You're going to stumble. You might fall. But you have no choice but to keep moving forward. Because living people don't stay in tombs. And so you've just got to keep rolling out, keep moving forward, and then Jesus is going to give you the same good news that he gives to others. Get those grave clothes off of him and let him go. And others are going to come and they're going to gather around you. And maybe where you're locating yourself in the story this morning is you're looking around and you're thinking, man, everybody around me is a mess. Maybe that's because Jesus is telling you, hey, stop complaining and stop judging and start helping get those grave clothes off. Start being part of my kingdom. Start being my hands and my feet. Start providing compassionate care to those that I'm calling in to new life. And then they walk out of the tomb and they walk back to where they are. And about a week later, they all come back and then this wonderful celebration dinner. And Mary offers her extravagant worship. And maybe that's where you are this morning. Of the Lord has answered, but you have not responded with the extravagant worship that his gifts to you would require. Or maybe where you locate yourself is in John chapter 12, verses 9 through 11, where life has been really good, and Jesus is saved, and he's delivered, and he's healed, and now here it goes again. And you've just got to run it back. See, what Lazarus' story ultimately teaches us is every story is a resurrection story. And so I don't have to freak out. I don't have to panic. I don't have to have the, oh Lord, where are you? Why have you abandoned me? I can't believe you would allow me to go through this again. But I'm just going to calm down for a moment and I'm going to recognize, no matter where I am in that story arc, Jesus is there and Jesus is working. And my story and your story always ends in resurrection. It always ends in new life. And in a few moments, we'll receive communion together. And as we do, that's what it reminds us of. Right? Because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, we now carry that same hope of resurrection in us. And so even if death wins, we win. Because he's promised new life. He's promised eternal life. He's promised resurrection. And that will be our experience. So if the enemy's coming at you today, you can look at him with peace and comfort and just say, okay, so we're going to run it back. But you know how this ends. This ends in the victory of Christ becoming my victory. This ends in the life of Christ becoming my life. And even if you kill me, he's going to raise me to life again. Will you take that bread and cup in your hands? As you do, will you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we come to you this morning thankful that you speak so clearly to us through the Scriptures. Lord, we're thankful that these aren't just stories we read, but they're stories we live. That the experience of Lazarus, of Mary, of Martha, of the disciples, of the mourners, of the celebrators and the haters, Lord, all of these are our stories as well. And as you invite us into them, Lord, we pray that we would find our place in you. Lord, I pray for those who are in the room or online with us today, and they've never made that decision to surrender their lives to you. Today, Lord, may they hear you calling them out of darkness and into light, out of death and into life. May they take their place as your sons and your daughters. May they receive the forgiveness and life that you have made possible for us. If you've never done that, it's a very simple prayer. Just even this morning, in your heart and your mind right now, you're just going to pray, Jesus, forgive me of my sins, and let me take my place in your kingdom. Be my Savior, be my King, be my Lord. And as you pray that prayer, your soul moves from darkness to light. Your soul moves from death to life, and you participate in what Jesus has for you. Lord, I pray for those of us who are here today that we find ourselves at different points along Lazarus' story. Some of us have just received our bad news. Some of us are waiting for your intervention. Some of us are grieving that things have not gone how we wanted them to. But Lord, all of us want to be aware that you are here in the middle of our situation. That you are working and you are moving. That you are resurrection and life. Jesus, I pray as we receive communion this morning, it would be a physical reminder to us of the eternal transformation you've made possible. Come and remind us that you are writing our story. You are with us every step of the way. Nothing has surprised you, and you're working through it all. In Jesus' name. Take the bread with me. And the cup. After you've received communion, will you stand with us? The band's going to lead us in a final song of celebration this morning. It's one they've introduced to us over the past couple weeks. It's just a reminder that because of what Jesus has done, every moment is different. Because of what he's done, anything is possible right here, right now. The state of your soul does not depend on your circumstances, but on the God who's working in them. And if you're in a place where you need somebody to join with you in personal prayers, if you'll head out the back doors and to your left, our prayer team would love to pray those with you. If you're online, you can do that at christianchapel.com/prayer. The rest of us, as they go to receive prayer, we're going to sing this final song as a declaration, a celebration, a reminder that life is possible because every story is a resurrection story.